following the news of the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh today. James Mates presents a special documentary looking at the life of the Prince.
The marriage of Philip Mountbatten to Elizabeth Windsor in November 1947 not only brought a moment of joy to a population still beset by post-war austerity, but also offered some hope for the future. She was a beautiful young princess, heiress presumptive to the throne of the United Kingdom. He was a handsome, dashing Navy lieutenant with an intriguing and exotic background. It was the beginning of a lifelong union that produced an heir to the throne, Prince Charles, 3 further children, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward, and numerous grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Theirs was a remarkable partnership. Prince Philip became the longest-serving royal consort in British history. So who was the man whose role was to stand one step behind, one step to the side of his wife, the Queen? When Philip Mountbatten had first appeared at his famous fiancée's side for the official engagement photo call, there was genuine puzzlement as to his origins. Where did he spring from? What was his real name? And more to the point, was he a suitable match for the future Queen of England? Philip's early years were certainly unusual. He was born in June 1921 on the Greek island of Corfu, in the palace of Montrepos.
He couldn't see that being born on a kitchen table in Corfu and having a peculiar upbringing by any standards was in any sense unusual. I can remember asking him from time to time, "Sir, you had a very unusual upbringing. How did it affect you?" "Unusual? What do you mean unusual?"
His father was Prince Andrea, second youngest son of the King of Greece. But the Greek royal family was not really Greek. It had in fact been drafted in from Denmark in the 19th century when Greece needed a new king. Philip's mother, Alice, was partly German. She was also a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. That made Prince Philip of Greece a distant cousin of his future wife, Queen Elizabeth. The early 1920s were turbulent times. Greece was fighting a hopeless war against Turkey. Philip's father, Prince Andrea, was a serving army officer. He disobeyed a reckless order to attack the enemy, and he was court-martialed. Though his life was spared, he was banished forever. The family, including the 1-year-old Philip, were rescued by the Royal Navy.
Prince Philip was famously described by one of his relatives as a dog without a basket. The exile of his father and his father's family, this extraordinary mélange of European, Danish, was he Greek? Nobody quite knew, and I don't think he knew himself. But of course, that was something he made a quality of his own. He forged his own life and his own identity.
The family settled in Paris. They had little money and relied on the generosity of their many relations and friends.
His father, I'm sure, was a very jolly character, but was spending most of his time taking a daily stroll to the Ritz to have a glass of champagne with his cronies and a good joke.
But exile treated Philip's mother, Princess Alice, more harshly. She had always been devoutly religious.
Prince Philip was only 8. The family was staying with relations in Germany. Prince Philip and his sisters were taken out for the day by their grandmother. Their mother had been, in the meantime, visited by a psychiatric doctor who forcibly injected her with a sedative. bundled her into a car and took her off to a secure sanatorium, where she remained as a prisoner. And Prince Philip saw her occasionally over the next 2 years. For the next 5 years after that, he neither saw her nor heard from her at all.
All four of Philip's elder sisters were quickly married off to German nobles. The house in Paris was shut up. Philip spent his holidays from prep school in England being passed around assorted family and friends.
I remember Prince Philip very well, of course, as a child, because he was a couple of years older than me. He might have been about 10 or something when I first remember him coming for the holidays, because, of course, he had no home of his own to go to.
He didn't have what you would want a child to have. That's his own bed and his own room, and going back to it the whole time. He went to stay with his sisters and he came to stay with us. And he saw a normal family set up with us, because we were always all together, so he was part of that. And then when he was with the Mountbattens, he'd be part of that.
And one always looked forward to it, because here was this nice young boy prepared to play games and tease one and wake everything up. You know, he was fun.
I think Prince Philip's unusual upbringing had the effect of making him extremely self-reliant.
Prince Andrea ended up living the life of a playboy on the Riviera. Philip's mother was eventually released from the asylum. She went on to become a nun in the Greek Orthodox Church. In the meantime, Philip had an encounter that would have a profound influence on his approach to life. Philip was sent to Schloss Salem in Baden, Germany, his sister Theodora's home. Theodora's husband, Prince Berthold, had set up a pioneering school there run by the charismatic and eccentric figure of Kurt Hahn. Hahn was Jewish. When Hitler came to power, he became an outspoken critic of the Nazi regime. Kurt Hahn fled to Britain, where he set up another school, Gordonston, near Lossiemouth, on the windswept Moray Firth in Scotland. Philip followed him there in 1934. It was a formative time for Philip. Gordonston emphasised physical toughness, personal development and leadership skills. They were precisely the qualities that would inform the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme that Prince Philip would later set up.
The regime there was Spartan and muscular, to say the least. Getting up at 6:30 every morning for a cold shower and a bracing run. Between 10:30 and 11:15, there would be a quarter of an hour break for high jumping and throwing the javelin. Hahn believed that high jumping was particularly good for the development of decision-making.
He responded to all the leadership challenges. If you divide people into the category of those who command and those who like to be commanded, he's a commander rather than one who likes to be ordered about. So he was a good leader, and he enjoyed that a lot. And it gave him some stability, I think.
While he was at Gordonston in 1937, far from his scattered family, he received terrible news about his beloved sister, Cecile.
Prince Philip didn't break down. His sorrow was that of a man, were Hahn's words.
Cecile had died in a plane crash along with her husband, his mother, and their 2 young sons.
I think possibly his earlier traumatic experiences had, to some extent, hardened him. He went to Germany for the funeral. Desperately sad, obviously, but quite strange as well. He was in a procession in a civilian suit, but to either side of him were his German brothers-in-law, one of them in an SS uniform, another in an SA brown shirt. The crowd were all giving the Heil Hitler salute. It was the first time that his parents had seen each other since his mother had been detained.
At this point, his mother was shocked out of what she'd been going through, and having been in a clinic or living very quietly for 7 years, she suddenly returned and sort of became his mother again.
Philip went on to have a close relationship with his mother, and Princess Alice lived her last years at Buckingham Palace. After his sister's funeral, Philip returned to Gordonston, eventually becoming head boy. He then enrolled at the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth. There he had a meeting that would, in time, transform his life. At the end of July 1939, the royal family paid an official visit to the college. Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret were due to attend a service in the chapel. Two of the cadets had developed mumps, and it was felt safer that the princesses stayed away. Philip, whose uncle Louis Mountbatten was with the royal party, was asked to look after them.
This was a moment of love at first sight for the Princess Elizabeth. She saw this astonishing, handsome, young 18-year-old, and she fell in love with him. For him, of course, she was just a 13-year-old girl, but she was the one who was going to be Queen of England one day.
She authorised her father's official biographer to say that she fell in love with Prince Philip at Dartmouth. Whether he did with her, of course, that's another thing.
In any case, that romance, which would in time lead to a long-lasting marriage, would have to wait. Within 2 months of that Dartmouth meeting, war was declared. Philip joined the Royal Navy at the lowest rank, midshipman. He was initially not allowed to take part in the fighting.
As a Greek citizen, he was prevented from serving in a theatre of war, so much to his chagrin, he was put on a battleship escorting Australian and New Zealand troopships in the Pacific. When Greece entered the war on the Allied side in August 1940, he was at last free to see action, which he was desperate to do.
He served on HMS Valiant in the Mediterranean, where he was mentioned in dispatches for his service at the Battle of Matapan.
The Battle of Cape Matapan was our greatest victory over the Italian Navy in the whole of the war, in which he was in charge of a vital area which was searchlight. He kept the searchlights on the Italian cruisers as the British fleet sank them. A brave and notably impressive sailor.
Later in the war, he was promoted to lieutenant, one of the youngest in the Royal Navy. He joined HMS Whelp as second in command.
I saw this lieutenant walk in front of me, and because I was carrying luggage, I didn't salute him. But I did apologise afterwards, and he took it in good grace. As first lieutenant, he controlled most of what was going on, including me. He was a very good first lieutenant. No question about that.
HMS Whelp was sent to the Far East. It saw heavy action with the British Pacific Fleet.
We were stationed in the very centre of this fleet to rescue pilots, and I saw several Japanese kamikaze aircraft, as Prince Philip would have done. Horrendous, horrendous situation.
Philip and the rest of the crew were in Tokyo Bay when the Japanese signed the Instrument of Surrender. Hostilities had ceased, and there was now time for rest and recuperation.
He grew a beard when we were out in Australia. He sported quite a nice, attractive beard, and of course, the ladies used to come on board and were very keen to do so on social occasions when we were refitting or whatever.
It was certainly the photo that Princess Elizabeth was fondest of. They had kept in touch during the war, and he would sometimes get the chance to see her.
He did spend time with his aunt, who lived near Windsor. He did come to Windsor. He was there for one Christmas pantomime, and Princess Elizabeth wrote to her governess, Corfie, saying we'd had a film and we danced and we had great fun.
After the war ended, Philip was assigned to teach petty officers at Corsham. His romance with Princess Elizabeth gathered pace. In the summer of 1946, during a visit to Balmoral, the pair began to talk about getting married. The first public hint that romance was in the air came at Patricia Mountbatten's marriage to Lord Brabourne at Rumsey Abbey.
The princesses were entering the abbey, and Princess Elizabeth was taking off her wrap, and Prince Philip, as an usher, was standing there and taking it for her. But somehow or other that just caught people's imagination, and people began thinking, aha, is there anything in that? It was quite interesting how that happened.
But King George VI worried that it was all moving too quickly. Elizabeth was only 20 after all. He persuaded them to wait until she had turned 21, which she would do during the planned royal visit to South Africa. Her 21st birthday broadcast, heard around the world, was one of her most significant ever. It showed how seriously she took the task that lay ahead of her.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Philip too had to prepare for the role on the royal stage. He gave up his Greek title and became a naturalised Briton. He took the name Mountbatten, the English version of his mother's maiden name, Battenberg. Philip Mountbatten and Princess Elizabeth were reunited when the royal family returned. The official announcement of their engagement could at last be made. The wedding in November 1947 was the first set-piece royal event of the post-war period, a time of rationing and austerity. To mark his arrival on the royal stage, the king made Philip the Duke of Edinburgh on the eve of the wedding, and a Royal Highness.
Although the palace very much worried about the way in which the British people would take to Prince Philip, the British people loved Prince Philip pretty much from the word go because he had been brave in the war.
The morning of his wedding, we had breakfast alone together. I asked him how he was feeling. I mean, any bridegroom must be feeling a bit nervous, and his case was obviously even more so. And he said, yes, well, I sometimes wonder if I'm being very brave or very foolish. And I said, you're definitely being very brave, but you're not being foolish.
Philip did feel brave enough to give up smoking that very morning at Princess Elizabeth's request. She knew the damage it had done to her father's health.
It was a great moment of joy, really, after all the horrors of the war and then all the restrictions on food and clothing and everything else that we'd gone through for so many years. I can remember the fun of driving to the Abbey and waving to the crowds out of the windows. But we felt ourselves very glamorous at that time.
Philip's premonition of what life in the royal drama would be like could only have been heightened by the beginning of the honeymoon. They spent the first few days at Broadlands, his uncle Louis Mountbatten's house in Hampshire. They were by no means alone. When they went to a service at nearby Rumsey Abbey, there was a ready-made audience desperate for a glimpse of the happy couple. It was only when they went on to Birk Hall on the Balmoral estate that they could get some peace and quiet. Returning to London after the honeymoon, the couple were faced with difficulties. To begin with, they had to find a home. Their prospective house in Windsor, Sunninghill Park, burnt down. They temporarily moved in with his in-laws in Buckingham Palace, where he faced a decidedly frosty atmosphere at court.
I remember Princess Margaret saying something to me about the men with moustaches in a very disparaging way, and the men with moustaches, on the whole, hated Prince Philip and everything to do with him.
Prince Philip had a very tough time from the supercilious courtiers who surrounded George VI. They were always suspicious of the Mountbattens, a bit too clever by half. They didn't like his uncle very much. always catching the headlines, and they suspected Philip of doing the same.
I remember talking to a relation of his. She simply said they were bloody to him. They looked down on him because he hadn't gone to Eton or Harrow. He was a foreigner, and again, he had German blood, and we're talking about just after the war, when there was a lot of anti-German feeling about. So I don't think he was welcomed. But I think that when they saw what a success the marriage was, and then when Prince Charles was born, I think attitudes changed.
An heir to the throne, Prince Charles was born in 1948. Clarence House was finally ready for the growing family, and Princess Anne was born there in 1950. Philip was promoted to lieutenant commander and appointed to his first command, HMS Magpie, based in Malta. Princess Elizabeth accompanied him there, and for once they could live the life of a typical naval couple.
They were indeed very happy, united, small family, enjoying having children, seeing them grow up. And probably the happiest years of their lives, I think. And it was possible for them to really live the life of a young naval officer and his wife.
The relatively normal life of a young naval couple was not to last. The problem that loomed over them was King George VI's health. He was a heavy smoker, and he had been weakened by the stress of the war. In 1951, his left lung was removed following the discovery of a malignant tumour. His health was so poor that he had to miss the royal tour of Australia and New Zealand planned for 1952. It was decided that Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh would go instead. The King was determined to come to the airport to see the young couple off.
When we look at those images, we know what's about to happen, and he looks very gaunt and ill. And indeed, people who were there at the time, who hadn't seen him for a little while, who were very familiar with him, all said they were horrified by how he looked.
The trip began with a visit to Kenya. The young couple even had time to go on safari. King George died in his sleep that very night.
It fell to Prince Philip to tell the Queen that her father had died. Prince Philip was utterly devastated. Not just, of course, that he knew how sad this was going to make his wife. He appreciated the way in which their lives would be turned upside down by this, and the chance of having a quiet moment of happiness before the onslaught of royal duties was now gone forever.
The image of her coming down those steps from the plane, it was, of course, a shock to everybody in the country. There we see Winston Churchill, Attlee, Eden, the political greats of the time. It was a terrible shock to everyone, but to her in particular, because she had enjoyed her early married life. And I think she must have felt a sense of imprisonment. But that was her destiny, and it was always her character to rise to the duty.
The King's sudden death effectively put an end to the Duke of Edinburgh's hopes of a long and successful career in the Navy. He could no longer be his own man. His destiny would be to stand at his wife's side.
If the death of George VI imprisoned Elizabeth, it was much more of a blow to Prince Philip. After all, his wife, sad though she was, now had the job of her life to do, whereas what had been his career to that point was knocked from under him.
I interviewed Admiral of the Fleet Lord Lewin, and Lewin had got to the very top in the Royal Navy, made a point of saying to me, I was very lucky because Prince Philip had to give up halfway through, and if he had been able to go on, he would have got to the top, not me. It was a big blow to him, and he hadn't expected it.
There was also the immediate problem of a name for the children born to Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh.
The royal family name was always a bit of a bone of contention. Lord Mountbatten, Prince Philip's uncle, was very anxious that the royal family should carry the name, it should become the Royal House of Mountbatten. And this wasn't going to happen.
Winston Churchill's government in 1952 stated by order in council that it was going to continue to be called Windsor, not Mountbatten Windsor.
Churchill, who was the Queen's first Prime Minister, and she was quite young at the time, advised her, so to speak, that really it would be wise to keep to the Windsor name. And she, I think, felt she should follow her Prime Minister's advice. And of course, very understandably, this deeply upset Prince Philip, very understandably. He said, well, I must be the only man in this country who's not allowed to give my name to my children.
It wasn't until 1960 that a compromise was reached.
There were changes. Non-royal descendants would be known by the name of Mountbatten Windsor. And then, as we know, even royal members of the royal family, Prince Edward, adopted the surname of Mountbatten Windsor.
One thing everyone could agree on was to make the coronation a success. The date was set for the 2nd of June, 1953.
The funny little things one remembers, some of the peers, realizing they had to be there all day, had brought some sandwiches tucked into the tops of their coronets. And then the other thing I remember, just before the Queen arrived, 3 lovely, what we used to call in those days, char ladies, cleaners in blue overalls, with hoovers, arrived and very sensibly hoovered the beautiful blue carpet that they were going to process up, which was, of course, a very good idea, but there was something so totally incongruous in the middle of the splendor of Westminster Abbey.
Philip had been made chairman of the Coronation Commission. One key decision was whether the coronation should be televised. Initially, the palace was not in favour. After a campaign in the press and the House of Commons, the Queen decided that the cameras should be allowed in.
A lot of people went out and bought television sets specifically to watch it. There were many streets where there was one television and everybody gathered around that one machine in order to see this fantastic thing happening in rather flickering black and white images. Not ideal, but anyway, better than nothing, and they'd never seen anything like it before.
I, Philip, will become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship. In faith and truth I will bear unto you, to live and die, against all manner of folk, so help me God.
And supporting the Queen in all her duties became Philip's life's work. That same year, he accompanied the Queen on a Commonwealth tour that took in the West Indies, New Zealand, Australia, and Africa. Each country took pride in demonstrating its own allegiance to the Crown in its own distinctive way. Over the years, there were more than 40 tours involving more than 170 individual country visits by land, air and sea. Philip also accompanied the Queen on thousands of visits and functions around the United Kingdom. But when he wasn't supporting the Queen, what was he supposed to do? The monarch had a clear set of duties and a predictable diary of events covering the whole year. Not so Philip. He would have to write his own script.
The only defined role, as we well know, is that of the sovereign. So a consort has to find their own direction.
It must have been tremendously difficult for him, a man who was naturally deeply dynamic, somebody who was energetic, who was fascinated by so many areas of public life.
A less self-confident man would have struggled to define a role for himself. With Philip, it was the reverse. At a time when there was a risk of the Cold War turning into real war, he spoke out for peace.
The choice before us is quite simple as well. It is either the destruction of the world or a peaceful world society. And it is up to us to make the choice.
Philip knew how fast the world was changing outside the narrow confines of the royal palaces. He was fascinated by science and technology and relished the chance to go and see for himself how things worked. He also trained as a pilot and in time flew thousands of hours in a variety of aircraft.
What do you think of the level of noise and smoke?
I was inside and I wasn't smoking.
Philip's relentless energy showed itself in his appetite for sport. He was an enthusiastic cricketer. But he was perfectly aware of the modesty of his talent, certainly compared with former Australian cricket captain Sir Donald Bradman.
He has a perfect action for a right-hand off-spin bowler. We have been accused at times of being ungenerous, so I submit that to the English selectors straight away.
He also played polo for many years. And when he finished playing polo, he took up carriage driving.
He was really good. He won a team gold medal in the World Championships back in the 80s. He competed really seriously up until his late 80s. And he had one or two hurdles.
Oh, you idiot!
He always got back on the seat and drove again immediately afterwards. He was a fearless and tireless competitor, and winning was everything.
He always saw the funny side of things and relished the chance to give a full-throated laugh.
Gentlemen, now before I begin talking, I would like to say a few words. No, I really feel wonderful. I mean, to look at me, you wouldn't think I've had the flu, would you? No, I was in bed with 104. There's a lot of people in one bed. Look at the time, 20 inches of 3.
And if there was some clowning around at award ceremonies, well, that was fine with him too.
Now the historic meeting of the Duke and the Beatles. Award for the best beat group and best vocal record for dancing, She Loves You.
But Prince Philip also took very seriously the causes he believed in. Quite apart from his duty of accompanying the Queen, he personally became associated with over 800 organisations, as patron or president or some other supportive role. Perhaps his proudest achievement was the setting up in 1956 of the Duke of Edinburgh's Award Scheme, a programme of personal development for young people who he felt a particular affinity with.
The award scheme was the idea of Kurt Hahn. Both Kurt Hahn and the Duke had a vision for a programme that would engage young people from all backgrounds. And they saw it as something that would broaden their horizons.
This scheme is not a cure, it's a preventative. Once you've got a soccer hooligan, you've got a soccer hooligan, and somebody else is going to have to try and cure him of that. The purpose of the scheme basically is to try and catch people while they are moderately civilized still and keep them that way.
Prince Philip was very keen the scheme would help those who hadn't had a privileged upbringing.
Youngsters who had a strong personal background, their parents were supportive, their schooling was taken care of. He saw them as having a good start in life. And he felt that the award programme would provide for young people who perhaps didn't have that same start in life the opportunity to experience things that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
Another major achievement was Prince Philip's work as president of the World Wildlife Fund.
Coupled with the fact that before global warming became the issue that it is today, he was the first to draw attention to the environment, to the natural world.
I think Prince Philip was incredibly ahead of his time. Remember, in 1961, these issues were hardly known. People were not conscious of the degradation of the natural world in the way we are now. This was a man who could see ahead and could take a long-term view and identify important issues and focus other people's attention on them.
Totally useless for a lot of well-meaning people to wring their hands in conference and to point out the dangers of pollution or destruction of the countryside if no one is willing or capable of taking any action. Time is fast running out, and it remains to be seen whether those in political authority can shoulder their responsibilities in time and act quickly enough to relieve a situation which grows more serious every day.
Prince Philip's association with WWF was enormously helpful, firstly, in getting the organisation better known around the world, because he was a well-known figure internationally. Secondly, he was also helpful in gaining access to influential people in government, in business, and that was important in the organisation's advocacy, in enabling us to bring the case to the people who needed to make the important decisions that Prince Philip himself would have wanted them to make. Now that he has gone, there will be an opportunity to have a really good look at all the things that he did. And I think people will be very surprised at the breadth of his activities and the enormous contribution that he made in many walks of life.
One accolade that no doubt caused a royal eyebrow to be raised came from Vanuatu in the Pacific. On the volcanic island of Tanna, the Yuan Hanan revered him as a divine being who would one day return from overseas.
He reacted to his worship in Vanuatu with a certain amount of wry amusement, as he very often did when something seemed to him completely ridiculous.
Now, when one thinks he was brought up in the Greek Orthodox faith, his mother was a nun, his wife was the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, to be a god actually is something you pretty much take in your stride, I think.
Although Philip sent a photograph of himself posing with a ceremonial club, he never found it possible to visit the village in person.
They keep a photograph of Prince Philip in their cave, and they bow down before this. And if the Queen were to venture into the cave, she would be hit very forcefully and very immediately on the head with a large root or something. It's a bit like the Marylebone Cricket Club used to be, but she's not welcomed.
Despite all his external interests, Prince Philip was never in any doubt about his subordinate role. He was there purely and simply to help the Queen.
He always said to me and to others, and insofar as he wanted to be remembered for anything, he wanted to be remembered as somebody who had always supported his wife and made it possible for her to do her job. And everything else, such as the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme and the various activities in which he indulged himself, came after he had actually made it possible for her to do her job.
As the years went by, the family grew. Prince Andrew was born in 1960 and Prince Edward in 1964. Prince Philip took his role as father very seriously.
Prince Philip was very much the head of the family, and I think the Queen wanted him to be the head of the family. He was the one who sort of took charge of the children, even when they were young. He'd, go and play with them, give them swimming lessons. And I think that's the role he saw for himself.
I think Prince Philip was a naturally good father and grandfather. I mean, I've seen him with my own children, and like my father, he was excellent and always treated them as though they were almost the same age.
The Duke of Edinburgh was keen that his sons should experience the robust regime at Gordonston that he had enjoyed 30 years before.
Prince Charles was always a much more sensitive child, and I think he probably felt that he ought to help him to perhaps overcome some of his shyness and sensitiveness because of the job that lay before him in later life, which I think some people misinterpreted that because he was trying to be helpful.
I said to the Duke of Edinburgh once, why is it that you and Prince Charles seem so alike? You walk in the same way, you talk in the same way, you have similar interests, and yet we hear about and read about these differences between you when you seem so similar. He said, but there is a difference, the Duke of Edinburgh said. I'm a pragmatist and he's a romantic, and somehow a romantic thinks that a pragmatist can't love.
Despite the outward impression of unflagging positivity, Prince Philip himself found it hard to send the children off to school.
He came in, I can see him now actually. He came in the room and he looked very white-faced. And he went over to the drinks tray and he poured himself out a drink. And he sort of said, I need this or something, muttered under his breath. And he was very affected by it. He'd had a horrible day, dropping him there.
Prince Charles was later surprised at his father's feelings.
Years later, I don't know, we were talking about sending the children to school, a nightmare it was. I said, I burst into tears. I could never take them anywhere. I mean, my husband, poor man, he didn't like it much either. And he said, oh, he cared so much, didn't he? So I said, yes, he did. But I said, your father did, too, terribly. Oh, he said. I said, well, I can tell you, because I saw it. So I said, he didn't enjoy taking you to school very much.
After Gordonston, Prince Charles studied at Cambridge University, where, as well as graduating with a degree in history, he acted in college reviews.
Taking up the strain. This is most exciting, ladies and gentlemen. I've never seen anything quite like it before. I think I got quite a large one here. It's very, very large indeed.
He and all the members of the royal family were constantly on display. That brought stresses that other families do not have to endure. When the children of the Queen and Prince Philip later married, 3 of those marriages ran into trouble. In both Prince Charles's case and the Duke of York's, some lurid details emerged.
I always felt an enormous sympathy for both the Queen and Prince Philip when, very, very sadly, their children's apparently happy marriages started to fall apart. Having been through the same very sad experience and totally unexpected when one was young myself, I know only too well how deeply saddening and worrying this situation is.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate. Their Royal Highnesses have no plans to divorce, and their constitutional positions are unaffected.
As separation gave way to ultimate divorce, Prince Philip, as head of the family, still tried to maintain good relations with Princess Diana.
He was a man of great sensitivity, particularly when it came to the separation and the divorce of Charles and Diana, and he was enormously supportive of Diana.
We also know that there was an extraordinary correspondence between the two in which he tried to bring her back into her marriage.
But Diana's story was to have an ending that no one could have foreseen. On the 31st of August 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died after a car crash in an underpass in Paris, together with her companion, Dodi Fayed, and their driver. In London, the public was shocked.
It's just very sad. I didn't really follow much about her in life, but her death has hit me. I can't explain it.
The death of Diana was a particularly difficult and almost dangerous period for the Queen and Prince Philip and the whole royal family, because the most extraordinary thing happened that the British public, which were usually completely phlegmatic and not particularly worried by things, became quite hysterical.
Oh, Mrs. Shapkin.
Initially, the Queen and Prince Philip decided to stay up in Balmoral to protect their grandsons.
We were shaken to the core. Everybody must have been. My reaction would have been if I'd had my grandchildren there. Now, we've got to keep them here safe and quiet. Nobody can get at them, and we're here. And everybody else is having to deal with it that end. But, you know, the perception wasn't that. And I think that was sad, actually. Because I really think if you searched your soul, you'd probably have done exactly the same thing.
As time goes by, more and more people agree that she took the right decision.
They did finally come down to London, and the Queen addressed the nation in a moving tribute to Diana, live from Buckingham Palace.
What I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I hope that tomorrow we can all, wherever we are, join in expressing our grief at Diana's loss and gratitude for her all-too-short life.
The funeral united the nation in grief. It also brought the best out of Prince Philip.
The question arose of who would actually follow. William and Harry, the sons, were not going to walk behind the coffin.
Prince Philip said to his grandson, I think you'll regret it if you don't walk. And if you do walk, I'll walk with you.
As the coffin passed through the archway of Horse Guards Parade, Prince Philip was seen to touch William on the shoulder as much to say, "Are you all right? How's it going?" It did in many ways sum up the man that Prince Philip was.
Actions sometimes mean and show much more than words do, and he couldn't have said anything at that point. But he certainly knew the right move, didn't he?
But Prince Philip's spontaneity could sometimes backfire. His quick wit and candour made him vulnerable to committing gaffes.
I just said that I worked in a club, and then he asked, oh, what, a strip club?
The pace of the visit was last night clearly taking its toll.
We shot one tiger that happened to be lame at the time, anyway. And I imagine you weren't even born then, anyway, so I don't know what you know about it.
What is their impression of us at the moment as a country?
God, what a question. I didn't ask them all.
These gaffes were gleefully seized upon by the ever-hungry media.
Prince Philip's gaffes were a work of art, and I think that the current of national life would have been less rich without them. These were his escape vents. A bit of steam had to be let off for this man who was always happy to be one step behind his wife.
People will remember him as somebody who occasionally said things that might occasionally have seemed to be a bit upsetting. I think they were more often than not meant to be amusing because he had a great sense of humour. And I think in the end they rather expected it.
Many of these undiplomatic utterances happened on foreign tours when Prince Philip's guard was lowered.
I remember in China when he spoke to some students and he was saying things like Beijing is very boring, and then he said to these young lads, well, these students, what do you do here? And they said, oh, we chase rats around the flat to keep ourselves amused. And he said, oh, if you stay here much longer, you'll have slitty eyes. Now, when the student told that to a Sun reporter, it became a massive news story, so much so that when we got to the next city, all the wire services were demanding an explanation. And this press secretary said, it's a physiological fact that they have different eyes for us. And of course, everybody rushed for the phones and it became a massive story. It was a private conversation. The Duke had no intention of that being heard.
On another trip to Australia, he was once again overheard, this time talking to some Aborigines.
He said to them, are you still chucking spears at each other? And of course, you know, it was out of context because he'd been speaking to another tribe earlier in the day, and they said, oh, years ago we used to, you know, throw spears at each other. Of course, it's funny and also a story. And the Duke really went for me, saying, you know, it was a private conversation. It wasn't supposed to be reported like that. Because he was pretty bruised by it, because that's quite nerve-wracking for people to meet the Queen and then the Duke one after the other, and he's just trying to make it easier for them. But when he made a gaffe, he made a really good one.
I think the only way to survive is simply to shut your ears to a lot of what's going on. I think he knew that he was presented as a kind of, occasionally presented as a sort of ludicrous or irascible, or I think what would have jarred with him most was being accused of being a racist, which he just so certainly wasn't.
Everywhere he went, he did try to engage people in conversation. He tried to make a joke, and occasionally, if you make jokes with everybody you meet, one will misfire. But it was always well-intentioned. And he found it really frustrating, the way he became a caricature. He said to me, you know, I do my best, and yet here we are, we end up like characters in a soap opera. It's just ridiculous. But now the press have made a caricature of me. I've got to live with it.
By the time of their golden wedding anniversary, Prince Philip was able to reflect on his character with a certain wry amusement.
It's been a challenge for us, but by trial and experience, I believe we have achieved a sensible division of labour and a good balance between our individual and joint interests. Of course, after 50 years of experience, I find there's a great temptation to give advice. The trouble is that no two marriages are quite alike. However, I think that the main lesson that we've learned is that tolerance is the one essential ingredient of any happy marriage. It may not be quite so important when things are going well, but it is absolutely vital when things get difficult.
In a reciprocal speech the following day, the Queen acknowledged her husband's outspokenness.
All too often, I fear Prince Philip has had to listen to me speaking. Frequently, we have discussed my intended speech beforehand, and as you will imagine, his views have been expressed in a forthright manner. He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know.
And the Queen showed her gratitude for her consort's lifetime of service when she made Prince Philip Lord High Admiral of the Royal Navy in celebration of his 90th birthday in June 2011. The following year, Prince Philip once again took up position at the Queen's side for her Diamond Jubilee celebrations. The Thames pageant was held in appalling weather conditions, and despite putting a brave face on it, his subsequent illness forced Prince Philip to miss the rest of the Jubilee events. At the special concert outside Buckingham Palace, Prince Charles led the warm wishes for his father's speedy recovery.
The only sad thing about this evening is that my father couldn't be here with us, because unfortunately he is taken on well. But ladies and gentlemen, if we shout loud enough, he might just hear us in hospital and get...
In the last years of his life, Prince Philip suffered from bouts of illness, but he never seemed to give up. There was energy in his dedication and commitment to the armed forces. When the 100th anniversary of the First World War was marked with a sea of poppies at the Tower of London, he was at the Queen's side, reflecting on the sacrifice military men like him had made. There was a sense of fun that appeared to accompany Prince Philip wherever he went. Carriage driving remained a passion in his later years, and he continued to participate in events at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. Of all the charities he supported, it was his own, the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, of which he appeared most proud. In a rare interview, he told ITV why the scheme meant so much to him.
When you come to think of it, children come into the world completely ignorant and with no experience. At least this gives them some idea of what life is like. Yes.
His charity had been helping youngsters to achieve their goals for 60 years, and in a special ceremony for Gold Award winners, he seemed to be enjoying himself as he gently teased them over their decision to canoe on the Scottish lochs.
It wasn't a very good choice, was it? Because if you're going to do it by boat, you want to do it in a river, then you float down.
During his lifetime, the Duke carried out more than 20,000 public engagements. He entered retirement where it had all begun, London. His final day was spent with the Royal Marines. 65 years of supporting the monarch in her role as head of state and attending his own solo events came to an end with a march past, a royal salute, and then 3 cheers.
3 cheers to the Captain General!
I remember quite often saying to him, "What do you really want to be remembered for?" And he would look at me as if I'd asked the most ridiculous question. And he said, I shall be dead. Why should I care? You know, it's nothing to do with me. I shall be long gone.
And it's not till you die that anybody is likely to properly appreciate you if you've done anything decent. I think history should judge him really very kindly. I think he was a remarkable person at a remarkable time.
If we regard the reign of Elizabeth II as a success, most observers regard it as a triumph. The joint author of it was the Duke of Edinburgh.
He really was somebody who showed that honour and decency and duty and the really important things in life mattered to him and mattered to his country.
Prince Philip always said he didn't want a big, fancy funeral. And I think that sums up the essence of the man and the paradox of the man. There was never any doubt that he was the man in charge of the family. The Queen always did exactly what he thought. Well, just about everything that he thought. But I think he would want to be remembered for his ability to subdue that side of his personality and do his duty to his wife and to his adopted country, and to become the finest consort that the British monarchy has ever had.